Rodrigo Duterte's name once echoed as the fearless leader of the Philippines, a man who ruled with an iron fist and stirred fierce loyalty and controversy. But when he was suddenly arrested, many believed his political career was finished, his influence shattered behind cold prison walls. Yet, from the depths of detention, Duterte stunned the nation by winning the mayoral race in his own hometown, defying every expectation. How did a man accused of war crimes reclaim power so swiftly? And what dark forces made sure his grip on the city, and possibly the country, remained unbreakable? When Rodrigo Duterte stepped down from the Philippine presidency in 2022, his departure was met with both applause and deep relief. For years he had ruled the country with an iron fist, his war on drugs leaving thousands dead and communities scarred. Human rights groups labeled his policies as brutal, even barbaric. But among his supporters, Duterte remained a hero, a leader who had brought order to a chaotic nation. Still, the post-presidency landscape was unlike anything he had faced before. He no longer had the immunity of the presidency to shield him from legal consequences, and those consequences came fast. Barely a year after leaving office, Duterte was arrested. The charges were grave, multiple counts of crimes against humanity filed by the International Criminal Court. For years, the world had waited for some form of accountability, and now, at last, justice seemed possible. Cameras flashed as the once untouchable former president was placed in handcuffs. He was flown under tight security to a detention center in a remote province, far from the capital, far from his home. News channels ran wall-to-wall coverage. Analysts predicted the end of the Duterte era. Politicians distanced themselves. Even some of his allies went silent. In the public eye, his fall was total. He went from being one of the most feared figures in the Philippines to a man alone in a concrete cell. Davao City, his long-time stronghold, grew quiet. Murals of his face were taken down. Local leaders issued vague statements about moving forward. For a while it felt like the country might finally turn a page, but the silence, strange things began to happen. Anonymous banners appeared around Davao bearing messages like, "Bring back Tate Digong." Online groups that had gone dormant during his detention suddenly came back to life, flooding social media with stories of how safe and disciplined the city had once been under his watch. Then came the rumors. Whispers of secret meetings between his family members and local power brokers, unexplained campaign activity in barangays. A strange but persistent message began circulating. Duterte was going to run for mayor. From jail. At first no one took it seriously. It sounded like a joke, a sad final act for a man whose career had collapsed. But those who had watched Duterte rise before knew better. He had been counted out many times in the past. This time, even behind bars, he was preparing something bold. And as the wheels started turning, it became clear that his story wasn't over. It was only beginning again. While most of the country had moved on, believing Rodrigo Duterte's political story had ended behind bars, a small but powerful group in Davao City had very different plans. These were not just supporters. They were deeply entrenched figures from his inner circle, retired generals, police officials, businessmen, and loyal politicians who had benefited from his years in power. They called themselves pragmatists, but others saw them as enablers. They believed that as long as Duterte was alive, his influence could still shape the city, and maybe even the country. Their goal was not to restore his legacy. It was to bring him back into office, even from detention. It started with quiet strategy sessions held in private homes and hotel conference rooms. These were not campaign meetings in the traditional sense. They were more like war councils. Legal experts were consulted about election rules, constitutional loopholes, and what would happen if a detained individual ran for public office. To their surprise and dismay, the law was ambiguous. There was no explicit rule that prevented a detained person, even one awaiting trial for serious crimes, from running for a local government position. The idea that once sounded like a fantasy now had a legal opening. The Loyalists moved fast. They tapped into Duterte's remaining political machinery, much of which had gone underground after his arrest. Campaign materials were secretly printed. Old allies in City Hall were contacted. Neighborhood leaders, many of whom owed their rise to Duterte, were told to prepare for a comeback. The plan was bold, risky, and deeply unconventional. Duterte would run for mayor of Davao City, the position that had launched his national career decades earlier. But this time, he would do it from a jail cell. Purd began to spread and reactions were mixed. Critics called it a grotesque abuse of the legal system, a mockery of democracy. But for many in Davao, it sparked something else. Nostalgia. Duterte's years as mayor had brought a strange kind of stability. Streets were quieter, crime seemed lower. People remembered those years with a sense of uneasy comfort. The memory of order, no matter how it was achieved, lingered in the minds of voters. As the idea gained momentum, it became more than a campaign. It was a movement. Volunteers began organizing on social media, using hashtags that celebrated Duterte's toughness and loyalty to his city. The campaign slogan, "Strong then, stronger now," was coined and quickly went viral. What had started as a desperate plan among loyalists was turning into something real. Rodrigo Duterte, despite being detained and disgraced, was officially running for mayor once again. Rodrigo Duterte's campaign for mayor was unlike anything the Philippines had ever seen. Confined to a detention facility, he couldn't attend rallies, grant interviews, or appear in public, but that didn't stop his message from reaching the people of Davao. The campaign leaned heavily on imagery and memory. Billboards across the city displayed old photos of Duterte smiling with market vendors, inspecting crime scenes, or walking among the people without bodyguards. Pre-recorded videos of him speaking from his cell were carefully edited and released in timed intervals, each one pushing a carefully crafted narrative. Davao had lost its strength. The campaign knew that traditional debates and speeches weren't necessary. For many voters, Duterte's reputation was already cemented. His team understood that emotion was more powerful than policy. They flooded social media with stories of how safe people felt during his previous terms, how the streets were cleaner, and how criminals disappeared without explanation. Whether these stories were true, exaggerated, or completely fabricated didn't matter. They struck a chord in neighborhoods hit hard by petty crime, unemployment, and corruption. The idea of a leader who could get things done by any means necessary was tempting. While other candidates struggled to gain attention, local politicians with strong track records found themselves drowned out by the noise of Duterte's campaign. Some received anonymous threats. Others had their family members harassed. It became clear that running against Duterte wasn't just a political challenge. It was dangerous. A few quietly dropped out of the race, citing personal reasons. Those who remained were branded as weak, corrupt, or worse, tools of foreign powers trying to humiliate the former president. The campaign's most powerful weapon, however, was the sense of injustice it cultivated. Duterte's team portrayed him not as a criminal, but as a victim, a man unfairly persecuted for protecting his country. They framed the charges against him as part of a foreign agenda, accusing international courts of interfering in domestic affairs. This struck a nerve. Nationalism ran deep in Davao, and many people began to see the election not just as a choice for mayor, but as a chance to defy outside influence and reclaim their pride. By the second month of the campaign, polls showed Duterte in a commanding lead. What was once seen as a symbolic gesture, a run for office from prison, was now a real threat to the political establishment. The city's political climate shifted. Conversations at markets, churches, and barbershops turned tense. People didn't just talk about who would win. They wondered what it would mean for the city if Duterte did. As Duterte's campaign gained momentum, a familiar but unsettling pattern began to emerge. Reports from across Davao described a rise in intimidation tactics, suspicious surveillance, and late-night visits from unknown men, Community organizers who had spoken out against Duterte received anonymous phone calls warning them to stay quiet. A journalist investigating the legality of Duterte's candidacy discovered her apartment had been broken into. Nothing was stolen but her. A few known Duterte-era enforcers were even seen near polling stations during early registration drives, watching silently. Local law enforcement denied any knowledge of their presence. But people in the city knew better. They remembered how this group operated. No uniforms, no public statements, but absolute authority when they appeared. What alarmed watchdog groups the most was how normal this all began to feel. Residents started self-censoring again. Opposition billboards were vandalized or torn down within hours of being put up. Activists spoke in coded language or met only in secret. A chilling familiarity returned to the streets of Davao. The sense that certain lines couldn't be crossed, certain names couldn't be spoken. Once again, fear was being used as a tool, not through open violence, but through whispers, stares, and subtle threats. The city's law enforcement offered no comfort. When questioned, local police claimed to see no signs of coordinated interference. But many officers had deep ties to Duterte's earlier administration, and critics suspected complicity, or at least silent approval. Even the city council remained quiet, avoiding any acknowledgement of the growing unrest. What made this shadow network so dangerous wasn't just its tactics, it was its invisibility. There were no official chains of command, no formal titles, no fingerprints. It operated through fear and memory, relying on the reputation it had built years earlier. And now, as Duterte's campaign surged forward, it was working again, in full force. To many, the message was clear. The old order wasn't just returning, it had never really left. The recipient of the funds? A shell company based in Singapore, registered just months before Duterte's campaign was launched. Tracing the ownership of the company led investigators to a name few had heard in years: Lorenzo Del Mundo. Also known as Mr. Del Mundo, a shadowy businessman with a reputation for financing covert political operations across Southeast Asia. Del Mundo had once been a household name in whispered political circles. His name had been tied to arms trafficking, influence peddling, and illicit campaign funding in at least 3 countries. Then, around 2018, he vanished without explanation. Governments couldn't locate him. Media stopped reporting on him. Some believed he had died. But now, there he was, on paper at least, funneling millions into a campaign led by a man who was not only out of office, but also behind bars and awaiting trial for war crimes. Further investigation revealed a web of offshore accounts linked to Del Mundo, stretching from Dubai to the Cayman Islands. These accounts funneled money through small companies registered under fake identities, with the funds eventually arriving in the Philippines disguised as donations for civic development. One of these companies had previously supplied surveillance drones to Duterte's presidential administration, a connection too specific to be coincidence. When asked, Duterte's campaign team denied any connection to Del Mundo. They claimed the funding came from local supporters and patriotic donors, but journalists who tried to follow the money trail encountered roadblocks. Sources backed out at the last minute. Bank records disappeared. One reporter received a text message containing only 2 words: "Stop digging." Behind the smiling posters and catchy slogans was a much darker story. This wasn't just about loyalty or political nostalgia. It was about power, financed by someone who had no interest in democracy, only influence. And as the campaign grew stronger, so did the suspicion that Duterte's return to power wasn't being fueled by the will of the people alone, but by a shadow financier pulling strings from the darkness. Election night in Davao was supposed to be a celebration of democracy, a chance for the people to choose their next leader. But from the beginning, things felt off. Early in the day, long lines formed outside polling stations, many of which opened late. In some districts, voting machines mysteriously malfunctioned, forcing people to mark paper ballots by hand. Reports of missing voter names poured in. Power fluctuations hit key precincts, plunging centers into temporary blackouts just as votes were being cast. Still, the Commission on Elections urged the public to remain calm, insisting everything was under control. As the night wore on, strange incidents continued to unfold. Ballot boxes were seen being transported without official escorts. Independent poll watchers were denied access to tabulation areas. Several observers claimed to witness pre-sylled ballots in remote precincts, but by the time they attempted to report it, the evidence was gone. Social media platforms filled with videos of frustrated voters and confused poll workers. Yet despite the chaos, local media stations, many of which had ties to Duterte's old political allies, projected a confident narrative. Rodrigo Duterte was winning by a landslide. Just past midnight, the official results began trickling in. In area after area, Duterte dominated the vote. By early morning, the Commission on Elections announced the outcome. Duterte had secured over 60% of the vote. A detained man, facing international charges for human rights violations, had just won the mayoral seat of Davao City. His loyalists celebrated in the streets, setting off fireworks and waving banners. For his supporters, it was a moment of vindication. For everyone else, it felt like something far more sinister. Across the country, politicians and legal analysts expressed shock. How could someone in detention, unable to campaign in person, win so decisively? The commission offered little explanation, simply stating that there was no legal barrier to his candidacy. International observers, previously invited to monitor the election, were suddenly nowhere to be found. It later emerged that many had been denied visas or restricted from entering polling sites. Even the country's top election watchdog groups reported they were blocked from verifying final tallies. By dawn, the disbelief had turned to unease. The election hadn't just been unusual, it felt orchestrated. Legal challenges were filed immediately, but few expected them to go far. The judiciary had grown quiet in recent months, and several of its members were known to have past affiliations with Duterte's circle. The results, chaotic and opaque, were now official. Rodrigo Duterte, from a detention facility hundreds of miles away, was once again in charge of Davao City. And the question on everyone's mind was no longer how did this happen, but what happens now? In the days following Duterte's shocking victory, the country waited for a response from its highest office. But as the dust settled, the silence from Malacanang Palace became deafening. The current president, once critical of Duterte's methods, offered no statement of concern, no condemnation, not even a formal acknowledgement of the controversial election. Journalists pressed for answers at press briefings, but spokespersons deflected, citing ongoing reviews and respect for the will of the people. It didn't take long for political analysts to recognize that the silence wasn't just passive, it was strategic. Behind the scenes, whispers of a backroom deal began to circulate. Insiders hinted at confidential meetings between Duterte's representatives and senior officials in the national government months before the election. These weren't negotiations about justice or transparency. They were bargaining sessions. Power for protection, silence for survival. According to one leaked document, a memo circulated within the Interior Department had advised against interfering with regional political dynamics in Davao. The language was vague, but the message was clear: leave Duterte alone. It became increasingly apparent that Duterte's return to power was not simply tolerated, but perhaps even facilitated. Several officials who had previously supported accountability efforts suddenly reversed course. A key figure in the Commission on Elections, who had once questioned Duterte's eligibility, resigned unexpectedly. His replacement was a known ally from the former administration. Meanwhile, funding for human rights investigations into Duterte-era abuses was quietly cut, and international cooperation on related inquiries slowed to a crawl. Members of the opposition demanded transparency, but their voices were quickly drowned out. Some were targeted by sudden audits. Others found themselves entangled in surprise legal cases. One senator was arrested on what many believed were fabricated corruption charges. The political landscape was shifting, and those who didn't adapt risked being removed, or worse. For many Filipinos, the silence from the palace felt like betrayal. Duterte's arrest had once symbolized a turn toward justice and accountability, but now, with him back in power and the highest office choosing to look away, that hope was rapidly fading. The lines between former rivals and allies blurred. It seemed that the very system that once moved to prosecute Duterte was now bending to accommodate his return. In just a few short weeks, the national narrative shifted from cautious optimism to stunned resignation. What was once thought impossible had happened, and those in power weren't just allowing it, they were making room for it. The silence wasn't just complicity, it was consent. After Duterte's return to the mayoral office, even though he remained physically confined, the atmosphere in Davao City changed quickly and unmistakably. Orders issued from behind the walls of the detention center rippled through City Hall and into the streets. Checkpoints were reinstalled on major roads and at the entrances to neighborhoods, staffed by armed personnel in plain clothes. Curfews were enforced with renewed vigor, often accompanied by sudden raids on homes. They were suspected of harboring dissenters or criminals. The sense of freedom that had returned during Duterte's absence began to fade like a shadow. Residents who remembered the harsh days of the drug war noticed the return of tactics once thought buried. Nighttime cleanup operations, where people were taken without explanation and often never seen again, sparked fear but little public outcry. Families stopped asking questions. Community meetings were canceled or held in secret. Activists who had organized protests or spoken against abuses found themselves followed, harassed, or suddenly detained on vague charges. The few journalists still brave enough to report critically were warned off by veiled threats, both online and in person. The city's atmosphere was one of quiet repression. Even casual conversations were tinged with caution. Citizens avoided certain topics in public and stopped sharing critical opinions on social media. Davao's reputation as a model city under Duterte's earlier leadership now seemed like a warning sign, a place where control was absolute and fear became a tool once again, not through blatant violence in broad daylight, but through invisible pressure and the ever-present possibility of being watched. Local officials, many appointed or backed by Duterte loyalists, enforced these measures without hesitation. Police chiefs, known for their hardline tactics, were reinstated. City councilors who had once expressed concern about human rights abuses went silent or actively supported the new order. The judicial system in the city followed suit, with courts fast-tracking cases against activists and opposition figures on charges that often seemed politically motivated. For many residents, daily life was a balancing act between compliance and survival. The price of resistance had become too high. Yet, beneath the surface, a quiet unease simmered. Some community members began whispering about what was really happening behind closed doors, about disappearances and secret meetings. But fear kept most from speaking openly. In Davao City, Duterte's shadow had returned. Not just as a man in office, but as an invisible force controlling the city's heartbeat, reminding everyone that power was not something freely given or taken away. It was something enforced. As Duterte settled back into power from behind bars, a deeper layer of the story began to unravel, one that tied his political comeback to a vast and shadowy network stretching far beyond Davao. Investigative journalists and whistleblowers started uncovering a complex web of alliances between local officials, national politicians, and powerful business figures. This network wasn't just about keeping Duterte in office. It was about controlling the flow of money, influence, and even information across the Philippines. At the heart of this network were several companies linked to industries critical to the region: mining, real estate, telecommunications, and transportation. Many of these firms had been granted lucrative government contracts during Duterte's presidency, often under suspicious circumstances. After his arrest, instead of collapsing, these businesses grew stronger, quietly expanding their reach through shell companies and offshore accounts. Key executives maintained close contact with Duterte's family and his closest political allies, ensuring their interests remained protected. Leaked documents revealed that some of these companies had been funneled government funds labeled as emergency relief or infrastructure. Yet independent audits suggested that much of the money had vanished or been diverted to private accounts. Whistleblowers who tried to expose the corruption faced intimidation or worse. One former accountant disappeared after sending a detailed report to a national watchdog group. Another source inside the government who provided damning evidence was found dead under suspicious circumstances, officially ruled an accident but widely suspected to be murder. More disturbingly, it appeared that this network also controlled significant parts of the media landscape. Several major news outlets, once critical of Duterte's administration, had been quietly acquired by business interests linked to his circle. Editorial lines shifted, favoring narratives that portrayed Duterte as a victim of foreign interference and highlighting the law and order benefits of his return. Social media was flooded with bots and troll accounts spreading disinformation, targeting opposition figures and human rights advocates. These revelations painted a picture of a system designed not just to keep Duterte in power, but to shape the entire political environment. The network operated in the shadows, manipulating elections, silencing critics, and bending institutions to its will. It became clear that Duterte's comeback was only possible because this vast machinery was already in place, ready to mobilize resources, suppress dissent, and rewrite the rules. For many Filipinos, this was the darkest twist yet. The man who had once promised change was now the face of a deeply entrenched system that seemed impossible to dismantle. The question haunting the nation was no longer if Duterte would stay in power, but how far this hidden network would go to protect him. Just when many thought they had seen the full scope of Rodrigo Duterte's political resurrection, an unexpected revelation shook the nation to its core. Months after he took office as mayor again, a confidential report leaked to the press unveiled a secret deal between Duterte and a powerful foreign intelligence agency. The documents suggested that during his detention, Duterte had agreed to act as an informal intermediary for this agency's interests in the Philippines and Southeast Asia. In return, he was promised protection from prosecution and continued financial backing for his political machine. The revelation stunned citizens and experts alike. Duterte's image as a fiercely independent nationalist now seemed deeply compromised. Questions swirled about the extent of foreign influence on domestic affairs, especially since his campaign had consistently framed itself as a battle against external meddling. The very agency implicated was known for covert operations worldwide, often working behind the scenes to install or support leaders who would serve their geopolitical goals. Dynex of the deal revealed a chilling reality. The agency had helped orchestrate Duterte's campaign logistics, funneling money through complex offshore networks, manipulating media narratives, and even suppressing opposition voices. Surveillance technology linked to the agency was reportedly installed in government offices, giving them unprecedented access to private communications. The secret deal went beyond mere politics. It was a coordinated effort to control key sectors of the country, including its natural resources, military bases, and communication infrastructure. When the news broke, protests erupted across the Philippines. Citizens felt betrayed, not just by Duterte, but by a system that had allowed such hidden power plays to flourish. Calls for investigations grew louder, but attempts to launch official inquiries were blocked by politicians aligned with Duterte's network. The judiciary, already seen as compromised, dismissed petitions as baseless or politically motivated. International organizations condemned the revelations but faced resistance in applying pressure. The final twist in this saga was deeply personal. As the public grappled with the truth, reports emerged that Duterte's family had also benefited from the deal, receiving lucrative contracts and business privileges linked to the foreign agency's interests. This blurred the lines between public service and personal gain even further, fueling widespread cynicism. The nation was left questioning everything it thought it knew about its leaders and institutions. A man who had risen from detention to power was now revealed to be part of a far larger, more dangerous game. Duterte's story had begun as a tale of redemption but ended as a haunting reminder. In politics, the greatest power often lies not in the votes cast, but in the secrets kept. As the Philippines faced an uncertain future, the question remained: how could a country rebuild trust after such a betrayal?